staff had been there since the beginning of the school. But in fact, we found that it was actually quite difficult to get our minds around what we wanted to do. But we had a lady member of staff, a lovely lady called Ruth Martin, who took charge of most of those arrangements. She talked to some of the past students, past members of staff, and we produced a big exhibition, which was actually put up on display screens in the hall, and produced this rather nice little booklet which covers it all. And we were able to invite the founder head back to plant a tree, and there was also a fund set up which provided some landscaping around the school. At the same time, as we were dealing with the Silver Jubilee, we also had the business of integrating a whole cohort of students who came from Redbourne, because their school had recently been closed, and that was a big issue as well. So in a way, everybody having to come together in order to produce the Jubilee celebration was a way of bringing people together in a common purpose in what was for them a new school, but also celebrating the very real achievements of the first 25 years of Roundwood Park. Proud, yes, because I had recognised that I was coming to what was already then an exceptional school, and what has become over the years an even more exceptional school, with a lot of values, the things that are on the board there, and the way that people subscribe to those values and help to propagate them, I think is one of the real strengths of the school. That plus the very solid achievement academically and on the sports field and in social responsibility and all those things. And one of the proudest moments was when we got a newspaper headline saying Roundwood best in county, and that was a tremendous boost to people's morale and self-confidence. Because remember, the school had started as a small four-form entry secondary modern school for basically children who failed the 11 plus, and that was a very different world in those days. Those children had in effect been written off by society, and that was wrong. The founder head saw that, and that was one of the reasons why over the country as a whole comprehensive reorganisation came in order to give a much fairer opportunity to all youngsters from 11 upwards. Yeah, that's an interesting point, Jack. Because the industrial action came not long after I first arrived, and in fact it was just after the Silver Jubilee, it was a pretty bleak time, because unfortunately, however much I might have sympathised with the view of ordinary members of staff that they were underpaid, as indeed they were overworked and underpaid, my responsibility was obviously to the school and to the parents to try and keep the thing open, which meant that there were times when I was very much on my own, supervising the school or sections of it without very much in the way of assistance, and it was a very uncomfortable time. It also, some of that industrial action took place in the winter, so you had bad weather as well as staff withdrawing their labour, sometimes at short notice, so you had to well, you tried to avoid sending children home, but sometimes you had to. And the governors were divided, the parent community was obviously very upset because parents couldn't make sensible arrangements if they didn't know from one day to the next whether their child would be able to go to school or not. Fortunately, examination groups and things like that were protected against the consequences of industrial action. But it was, as you said yourself, it was a time in wider society where there was a lot of turbulence, and it was the early years of a fairly hard-line Conservative government wanting to impose their view of things, particularly on public services. Obviously, education is one of the biggest public services, was there, and it was quite understandable that it was in the front line. But uncomfortable times, I'm glad when they were over. I'm glad we were able to rebuild trust and good relationships and things like that, and then be able to move on to the real business of running a decent school.
In the mid-1980s, one of the most important events in Roundwood's history began to unfold. In the 80s, demand for school places were dropping nationally, and Harpenden and St Albans area was no exception to this, which led to the council in 1986 proposing that both Roundwood Park School and Sir John Law School were to close, and a new merged school would open in their place.
The plans were met with large controversy by parents, teachers and governors. The main argument was against the proposal of split-site working. The council planned to have the new merged school open on both of the existing school sites, with one running as a lower school and the other as an upper school, and the Sir John Laws site would eventually close. One of their strongest arguments was what they claimed was evidence of the county's miscalculation in pupil numbers, and made the claim that 1,000 children in Harpenden would have to walk to a school in St Albans if the plans went ahead. After months of discussion, on the 28th of July 1987, the council decided against the plans and the merger was cancelled.
The big issue of the late 80s was the possible merger or closure of the school, and that was all tied up with a huge piece of reorganisation that the county wanted to bring about in what was then called the St Albans Division. So it included Harpenden, Wheatomstead, Redbourne, St Albans and London Coney. And at that time, school rolls were generally perceived to be falling. And so there was a case for closing schools, amalgamating schools to make them bigger and more efficient, more effective. And County produced a number of papers, and the initial proposal was to close Wheatomstead. Redbourne had already closed, and the idea was to close Sir John Laws, or merge Roundwood and Sir John Laws, but continue with the two separate schools on the separate sites. So it would have been what was technically called split site working. One school organisationally, one head teacher, but actually teaching taking place on two sites a mile apart. Staff didn't like that, governors didn't like it, parents didn't like it, and a group called the Roundwood Action Committee was formed to fight the proposal, and they were a very effective group. We were fortunate at that time to have a number of parents and governors who were professionally very highly qualified. They knew things like population statistics and how local government worked and so on, and they were well able to take on the county. And to cut a long story short, we were able to prove that the figures that the county was using to justify school closure were a nonsense. They would leave the whole northern part of the area seriously short of school places for an indeterminate period of time, which would have not been good for anybody, particularly not in Harpenden. One of their big mistakes was to not recognise the demography of Harpenden, which has a lot of people moving in with ready-made families of top primary and secondary school age, and that inflates the figure of school places needed. So eventually, triumphant day came at the beginning of 1987, where the county admitted defeat, admitted they got things wrong, and allowed both Roundwood and Sir John Laws to continue as separate schools with the success that they've enjoyed ever since. And of course, as you now know, there's a need for a fourth school in Harpenden. So just think of what a disaster it would have been had those original proposals gone through. The really killer headline is this one, which was perfectly true. 1,000 pupils would have had to travel daily out of Harpenden and Wheatomstead and Redbourne into St Albans in order to get school places. And as I say, the county admitted their mistake, and that was the end of it. But it was a very fraught 18 months to 2 year period when it was all happening, because until county said finally, yeah, we're going to abandon these proposals, we were all living on a knife edge. It was a period of curriculum consolidation and development. I mean, one of the biggest things that happened in that period was the gradual relaxation of local authority control, and particularly schools gaining control on their own budgets. I mean, when I first became a head, you had to go to county and make a case for even having a new electric socket on the wall. And it was hugely bureaucratic and very frustrating. But then when what was called local financial management, local management of schools, came in, that gave each school a budget. And I can remember the first time I suddenly realised I was responsible for a budget of about £1.5 million, a lot of money in those days. In fact, when I finished in 1997, the school's annual budget was just over 2 million. That's actually quite a lot of money to be in control of, although you know, you haven't got total freedom, because you know that in order to run a curriculum for a school of 1,000, you've got to have 57 staff or the equivalent, and that takes up a very large proportion of your budget. To have some freedom to move money around and say, well, this year we'll, you know, the good times will come to science. They'll get extra equipment or whatever because they made a good case for it. But next year they'll have to take a back seat because we'll be giving art and technology a bit more. That was a very, although schools were nervous about it in the first year or two, it actually became a very important freedom, a very important way of actually influencing how the school developed. Because you were no longer doing what people at County Hall said, you were doing what you recognised as being the most important thing for Roundwood Park at that moment in time. You had a national curriculum, yes, and Christine Hood's right about that, and not everybody was comfortable with it. But it also meant that there was particularly when children transferred school, there was a lot less inefficiency, because you could sometimes have a youngster come in who'd done, I don't know, done the Romans in history in 3 different schools at 3 different times, and then have to do them again in Roundwood. But the national curriculum made it much more efficient and predictable what you could assume people had already done or had not done. So it made sense. The other big change, which I've forgotten about, but it was huge at the time in the 80s, and it was something that you will have no feel for, is the change from a dual examination system where basically the bright children did O-level GCE, and the other 75–80% of children did the CSE, Certificate of Secondary Education. And in the early 80s, a unified system, GCSE, came in for the first time. And that was a huge, both a challenge teaching-wise and organisationally. And you know, everyone's forgotten about that now, because you know, that was a long time ago. Now it's all, you know, everybody does this system, and the real questions are about whether the exam system is as rigorous as it used to be. Has there been grade inflation? You know, does a grade A now mean what it meant 10 years ago, and things like that? But the fact that all schools had to manage a dual exam system until the mid-80s is passed out of most people's memory. It was a positive change, because when you had the old dual system, you had to decide, in your case, you know, whether you were going to do O-level maths or GCE maths, and you'd be going to a different set as a result. So it's actually, you know, dividing people into sheep and goats, and it was very invidious. So the unified system was much better, and really what most people thought was more just. Life in any school is always hectic, and you always think that each year can't get any more hectic than the one you just finished, and each time it does. And it's different things, but school life is always exciting, tiring. You always get some unexpected things happening, some sad, like if a pupil dies. I mean, one of the most traumatic events that happened in my home was A young lad was doing early morning paper delivery round up at West Common and got knocked over by a bus and killed. And that had a huge impact on the whole school. So things like that. But you know, you get exciting things as well, people's successes, a good concert or a drama production. I was telling Jack earlier about a fabulous end of summer term concert, a bit like Proms in the Park that we had out on the playing field when there was a bit more playing field space. It was a magical event. People were picnicking on the grass, had candles, music was good, it was lovely. So things like that you remember. Long after you've forgotten about having to put, you know, half a dozen people in detention for some bit of mischief that's gone on somewhere. So I think the dominant impression of any school, any good school, is vitality. I think it was slightly, yeah. There were still national issues, and of course the other big thing that came in the 90s was Ofsted inspection. I had one of those in my time as head, and it was pretty traumatic. In those days, it was a team of about 15 inspectors in the whole school for a week, turning everything over. Absolutely everything.
Did the school get a good mark?
School did, yeah, it came out very well. But the amount of stress on the staff leading up to that was very unfortunate. So in that sense, the 90s was clouded. But in other respects, because some building improvements had started to come through, the beneficial impact of local financial management was being felt. It was, in some senses, a better time. One of the other things that you always get a problem with is teacher shortage, and we've got it again now. And that seems to be a cyclical thing. But you know, it's desperate if you cannot recruit sufficient good teachers to put in public schools. You know, any child's school life, your school life, is the only one you're going to have, and you deserve the best. And if the system can't deliver that, then the system is failing people. And there were times when we could not always recruit the quality of teachers we really wanted. But that made up for the fact that we were able to recruit some gems over the years. Obviously, I would want to wish Roundwood well for the next 60 years. I'm very glad that it has survived to be 60 years old. I was very proud to be appointed head. Everything that I've seen in the years since has led me to believe that Roundwood is going from strength to strength. Long may it continue. It's a great school with some great people in it, and it's a jewel of the community. And I'm very glad that the move to shut it down in the 1980s came to nothing, so it can flourish for, hopefully, as I say, another 60 or 100 years, serving the people of Harpenden. And thank you for inviting me to take part in the anniversary celebration.